They say that in the winter of 1905, county archives recorded something that remains unexplained to this day. 39 experienced hunters disappeared within the silent confines of the Appalachian Ridge, all in the same season, all within a few miles of the same forgotten building, known only on the oldest maps as Iron Hollow. This name, corroded by time, is one of the few remaining traces of a region marked by wood, coal, and families who depended on the forest for their survival. At the beginning of the 20th century, Iron Hollow was just a lost spot among rolling hills and damp valleys, where the fog seemed to settle with permanent calm. There lived people accustomed to silence, men who left before daylight with rifles on their shoulders, women who kept stoves burning night and day, and children who learned early on that the forest could be generous, but never reliable. Among these names, one stands out more clearly in the old documents: the fragmented records of the so-called Iron Hollow Sisters, two women described vaguely, with almost no details, as if the community itself avoided mentioning them aloud. Censuses from the time identify them as Margaret and Eliza Calder, unmarried, both born around 1858. The papers don't explain much else, only that they lived in isolation on a property that existed even before the Civil War, a dark and narrow wooden structure built with iron beams reused from a decommissioned mine. The few preserved drawings of the place describe a deep basement reinforced with aged iron bars, as if someone, decades earlier, had tried to protect something, or prevent something from getting out. The remaining documents about the two sisters' lives are scarce. There is no mention of close relatives, no medical records, no purchase or sale notes. Only sparse statements from distant neighbors commenting that they went down to the village twice a year, always together, never saying more than a few words. The community seemed to treat them as part of the landscape, silent, discreet figures who asked for nothing and offered nothing. The winter of 1905, however, began differently. It was a year of persistent cold, early snow, and winds that swept the slopes with unusual force. The hunt had diminished, forcing men to venture farther than usual, and it is precisely during this period that the first records of disappearances begin, noted in careful, almost nervous handwriting in the county's incident book. The researcher who reviewed these documents decades later described something he found strange. There were no signs of animal attack, nor any tracks left behind, as if the men had simply disintegrated in the cold air. Many of the hunters were experienced, accustomed to the snow and steep terrain of the region. They knew how to deal with wolves, bears, storms, and even the brutal solitude of the mountains. Still, they disappeared, all leaving behind families who insisted that it was unusual for them to be gone so long. From that moment on, the files take on another layer of unease. The family's reports mention that some of the missing were last seen near the sisters' former property. Nothing dramatic, nothing specific, just a repeated coincidence noted by mothers, wives, and siblings who never imagined that their statements would become part of a century-old mystery. What stands out, and what has always stood out since the first rereading of these files, is an almost imperceptible detail. A marginal note written by the officer in charge in the winter of 1905, small, hidden near the darkened edge of the page. A short sentence, which seems to have been written not as a formal record, but as an involuntary confession. Something in their basement should not have been built that way. The historian who found this sentence, almost erased, was never able to identify exactly what the officer meant, nor why, among so many meticulously filled pages, only that one carried a personal comment, and such a disturbing one at that. And it is precisely there, in that forgotten fragment, that the enigma begins that still hangs over Iron Hollow today, over its two silent residents, and over the 39 men who walked toward the frozen slopes and never returned. But what really happened in the weeks leading up to the first major organized search, and why so many traveled the same trail without ever returning, only begins to take shape in the following pages of these brittle files. While county documents record the disappearances with almost mathematical precision, the same cannot be said about everyday life in Iron Hollow before the winter of 1905. Much of what is known has been pieced together from fragmented diaries, letters sent to neighboring towns, and oral accounts from descendants of families who lived in that region when the forest still dictated the rhythm of the weeks. From these, a picture emerges of a small, isolated, seemingly ordinary village, but one fraught with silent tensions that would only make sense after the events of that year. The community was mainly composed of woodcutters, seasonal hunters, and families of workers from coal mines that had been decommissioned at the end of the 19th century. The houses were simple, made of light wood, with sloping roofs to prevent snow accumulation. There was a grocery store that also served as a trading post, a small community stable, a church with short pews where the priest visited only twice a month, and a few miles away, the old trail that led to the Calder sisters' property. Before the name Iron Hollow became associated with mystery, it simply referred to the area where old iron structures, remnants of a foundry abandoned decades earlier, had been repurposed for houses and sheds. The sisters' property was the last building before the dense slope that plunged deep into the Appalachian Ridge. The few who passed by described it as a narrow, dark wooden house with small windows and a porch that always looked dusty, as if no one really used it. Daily life in Iron Hollow, according to reports, was not easy. The men went out to hunt deer, wild boar, rabbits, and occasionally to gather moss and herbs for medicinal purposes. The women took care of the house, the gardens, and the children, who grew up learning to respect the sounds of the forest. The crackling of branches, the calls of birds, the absolute silence that sometimes fell without warning, a silence that, according to testimonies from residents at the time, was always interpreted as a sign that some large animal was approaching. As far as records show, sisters Margaret and Eliza lived a distinct routine. They did not interact with neighbors, did not attend religious services, and did not receive visitors. The only evidence that they sporadically went down to the village were a few notes from merchants, purchases of salt, flour, kerosene, and cheap fabric. There are also reports that they spoke softly, in short, precise sentences, as if they were always in a hurry or afraid of being observed for too long. The oldest residents claimed that the sisters had lived there since their youth, after the death of their parents, although no one was sure about the family circumstances. For some, they were just reclusive women trying to survive. For others, especially those who had crossed paths with them on the dark trails, there was something indecipherable about the way they always walked side by side, with stiff steps and gazes that never seemed to fix on anything. Life followed a predictable rhythm until the beginning of the fall of 1904, when the first subtle signs of unrest began to appear. A hunter named Thomas Arden, whose diary has been partially preserved, wrote that he heard muffled voices coming from the north at a time when no one is usually in the woods. He does not describe fear, only strangeness. In another note, he mentions seeing faint lights in the valley, in an area with no known residences. Lights that looked like lanterns but moved too slowly, he noted. Another document, a letter written by a woman named Helen Ridge to her older sister, mentions that the men were returning from the forest more tired than usual. They say the wind is different, as if it carries some kind of lament, she wrote, without giving much importance to the detail. Historians believe that such observations were the result of local superstition, exacerbated by the fatigue of the season. However, later testimonies reveal a curious pattern. Many of the hunters who would disappear months later began to complain, as early as late 1904, of a constant feeling of being watched when they passed near the former Calder property. There was nothing explicit, no attacks, no strange roars, no suspicious movements. It was just a persistent impression, reported in almost identical terms by men who had no contact with each other, reinforcing the idea that something in that area, that winter, was different. The sisters, meanwhile, began to be seen more often, which for the residents was just the opposite of their usual behavior. One merchant claimed that Margaret had entered his store twice in the same month, something that hadn't happened in years. Another resident said he had seen them on the main trail at dusk, walking faster than usual, almost as if they were trying to avoid someone. Despite the growing strangeness, Nothing yet indicated the impending disaster. The men continued to hunt. Families continued their routines, and the snow began to fall earlier, covering trails and silencing the forest. Winter advanced, heavy, dense, endless, and little by little, the village began to realize that this season was different from all the others. The first disappearance would not be officially recorded until January 1905, but what the documents do not explain, and what only later testimonies reveal, is that a month before that, something was already happening on the slopes near the sisters' house. Something that few could describe. Something that none of them had the courage to discuss openly. Something that, apparently, had been lurking around the place long before the first man disappeared without a trace. And according to reports, it all started on a particularly quiet night, when the light of a lamp was seen moving toward the sisters' basement, long after midnight. When official records note the first disappearance in January 1905, snow already covered Iron Hollow to knee depth. The forest seemed to breathe slowly, suffocated by the cold, while the wind whispered through the trees as if carrying ancient memories. The name written on the page of the incident book was Elias Rowan, 38 years old, an experienced hunter, husband, and father of 2 boys. He left in the morning in search of deer and did not return at dusk, something highly unusual for him. His wife, Nancy Rowan, was the first to walk to the neighbor's house asking for help. She wore a scarf tied around her neck to block the wind and spoke with a trembling voice, not only out of concern, but also out of a kind of premonition she could not explain. 3 men followed Elias's trail to a clearing, where they found regular footprints, firm steps, and then nothing. The tracks simply disappeared into the untouched snow, as if the hunter had stopped in the middle of his walk and been erased without a trace. This account, repeated countless times over the decades, was considered by most historians to be a romantic interpretation of the situation. But the diary of one of the men present on that search contradicts the softened version. He wrote, "The footprints ended too cleanly. There were no skid marks, no signs that he had turned back. It was as if he had been lifted off the ground." From that moment on, tension began to grow quietly in the village. In the days that followed, 2 other hunters failed to return home. Henry Madsen, a young man in his 20s, and Samuel Krieger, known for his ability to track animals even in extreme conditions. Both had last been seen heading toward the hills surrounding the Calder sisters' property. What bothered the community most was not the geographical proximity, but the repetition. Experienced men disappearing at such short intervals was not something that could be attributed to the weather or predators. The researcher who analyzed these events decades later found among the documents a stained, hand-drawn map showing the last confirmed location where each of the 3 had been seen. It was a crooked, irregular triangle, but all the vertices pointed in the same direction: the sisters' house. But no one dared to say it out loud. As January progressed, reports of strange occurrences multiplied. A man named Gerald Boone said in a preserved statement that he heard a door slam violently in the middle of the night during one of the snowstorms. Something impossible, considering that his house had no loose exterior doors. Another woman, whose identity remains illegible in the original document, claimed to have seen shadows moving in the wrong way near the trees at the edge of the trail. She did not describe what wrong meant. She simply wrote, "They did not move like people, nor like animals." Taken in isolation, these testimonies could have been dismissed as common winter fears. But there was another disturbing element, repeated several times by different residents: the metallic sound. Almost everyone who passed near the former property of the Calder sisters, especially after sunset, reported hearing something similar to chains being dragged or iron bars vibrating, as if someone were working with heavy tools underground. The sound, according to reports, was not constant. It would suddenly appear, disappear, and return hours later. Sometimes it seemed distant, other times too close. But the central point was always the same. It came from the direction of the sisters' basement. It was around this time that Margaret and Eliza began to be seen even less. Some families claimed they had not seen them since the beginning of winter. Others said they had seen them only once. walking quickly, wearing dark cloaks, carrying large bags whose contents were never identified. There is a particularly disturbing statement from a man named Robert Flint, considered reliable by the historian who re-evaluated the documents. Flint said that one afternoon he was walking along the path that skirted the sisters' property and saw one of the side windows partially open. Inside, there was movement, slow, repetitive, as if something were being adjusted or lifted. He couldn't tell if it was one of the sisters or someone else, but he described a metallic glint, as if some structure had been built inside. The community began to go on alert. The local pastor suggested that men avoid going out alone, especially in the early morning and late afternoon, when the fog became denser. But the advice did not seem sufficient. After all, many depended on hunting for their survival. The next disappearance was what sealed the panic. Nathaniel Graves, a veteran hunter, often seen on the trails with his old rifle slung over his shoulder, disappeared on January 19th. He left his wife with a quick kiss, saying he would be back before dark. He never returned. His trail was followed for about a kilometer until it reached an area where the snow was churned up, as if he had stopped to observe something. After that, only 2 isolated footprints, and the rest of the snow completely untouched. In the original county report, the search leader wrote a comment that intrigued later researchers. The direction of the footprints indicates that he was looking toward the sisters' property. The men of the community began to gather every night at a neighbor's house to discuss what was happening. The idea that predators were attacking was quickly dismissed. No animal in the area was capable of making someone disappear without leaving a trace. Snowstorms could disorient hunters, but they did not explain trails that ended so abruptly. And it was in this atmosphere of growing fear that the expression that would be marked in the archives first appeared: the chamber. The term appears for the first time in a letter sent by a young man named Luther Haynes to his brother who lived in Ohio. In the text, he mentions rumors that the Calder sisters had a compartment in the basement built with iron beams from the old foundry. He writes, "They say they reinforced the underground more than any ordinary basement would need. They say it's narrow, deep, and cold as a prison cell. I don't know if it's true, but everyone seems to know it exists." The researcher who studied the case noted that the letter does not specify the purpose of the structure, and no subsequent document mentions anyone who has entered it. But the rumor persisted, and as more men disappeared, suspicion became inevitable. Something was happening on that property. Tension reached its peak in February when a group of 5 hunters decided, on their own, to investigate the surroundings of the sisters' house. They did not enter, knock on the door, or attempt direct contact. They just walked silently around the building looking for signs. One of them reported years later that the place felt colder than the wind. Another said he smelled iron, too strong for a wooden house. The third claimed to have heard a low, rhythmic sound, as if something were being struck side by side, inside the basement. The last man in the group, the youngest, confessed the following: "I felt as if someone was on the other side of the wall, standing still, listening to our every breath. They returned to the village pale and speechless. They never approached the house again." What happened the next day would become the final climax of this period, and the mystery that would haunt Iron Hollow for over a century. Because the morning after these men's silent visit to the property, the Calder sisters disappeared from everyone's sight. Neither was seen at the window. Neither was seen walking the trails. Neither came down to the village. And that same morning, when the wind was colder than ever, 6 more hunters disappeared in the space of just 3 days. The community collapsed, and when investigators finally decided to formally visit the old house in Iron Hollow, they found something that was not in any of the previous records. Something that would turn a missing persons case into one of the most disturbing files in the region. Something that, according to the only preserved report of that inspection, was hidden behind a narrow door in the kitchen floor. The official inspection of the Calder sisters' property took place on February 3rd, 1905, led by 2 county representatives and accompanied by 4 men from the village, the only ones who agreed to enter the house. The fog that morning seemed heavier than usual, descending from the hills like a dense curtain. The old wood of the building was damp, and the air had a metallic odor so subtle yet persistent that everyone present mentioned it years later, as if that smell had forever permeated the memory of the place. The original report, now yellowed, begins objectively. The front door was found unlocked. There were no signs of forced entry or evidence of a struggle. The document describes the narrow room with simple furniture, a wooden table, 2 chairs, an unlit lamp, and a cold stove, as if no one had lit a fire there for weeks. The walls showed small vertical marks, probably caused by the repeated movement of dragging something heavy, although this has never been confirmed. The kitchen, however, held the detail that would change the narrative of the case forever. Under a worn and weathered rug, the men found a narrow door in the floor, made of planks reinforced with iron strips. It was a basement entrance. This was stated in the report, but according to all the residents who had described the house over the years, none of them remembered seeing such a door before. For some, this could be explained by the sisters' isolation, as they rarely allowed anyone to approach them. For others, however, the fact was too disturbing. How could such a visible entrance have gone unnoticed for so many years? The document describes that the door opened with difficulty, creaking as if the hinges had not been used for a long time. The wooden staircase leading down to the basement was dark, narrow, and without a handrail. The metallic smell intensified as soon as the door was opened, causing 2 of the men to hesitate before even stepping down the first step. The basement, later referred to in reports as the Iron Hollow Chamber, was not large. On the contrary, it was a low corridor with walls reinforced by old iron beams, probably taken from the foundry that had been decommissioned in the previous century. The walls showed marks that resembled scratches, but the report, careful to avoid hasty interpretations, described them only as wear and tear incompatible with the age of the wood. At the far end of the basement was a structure that had never been mentioned by any of the residents. It looked like a kind of compartment, an extra room within the already cramped underground space, rudimentarily constructed with iron bars, overlapping as if they were makeshift bars. The door to this compartment was low and narrow, reinforced with 3 internal locks, but no external ones. This detail deeply intrigued the researcher who, decades later, re-evaluated the case. Why would such a small space have locks only on the inside? The original purpose of that place remains unexplained to this day. Inside the so-called chamber, there was no furniture or personal belongings, only deep marks on the wooden floor, like grooves made by the continuous dragging of something heavy. Boxes, barrels, tools. Nothing could be confirmed. The metallic smell was even stronger inside, almost suffocating. The forensic report, in its darkest passage, describes that one of the beams appeared to have been recently installed, as if someone had tried to reinforce the space shortly before the sisters' disappearance. There was no blood. There were no clothes. There were no remains, nothing to indicate direct violence. But there was something else. In the left corner of the chamber, partially covered by debris and dust, an object was found that would be mentioned in all subsequent analyses. A piece of thick fabric, rolled up and tied with a knot that required tools to undo. Inside it were small belongings that belonged to different men: a belt buckle, a heavy coat button, a piece of rope, and an empty rifle cartridge. None of these objects, taken individually, proved a crime. But the collection, found inside a space that no one could explain, raised the most feared question. Why were objects belonging to missing hunters there? When informed of this finding, residents reacted with contained panic. Some immediately believed that the Calder sisters were involved in the disappearances. Others insisted that it could just be a random collection of objects found in the woods. Families were torn between fear, anger, and disbelief. The entire village was paralyzed for days, fearing that new men would disappear at any moment. The most intriguing thing, however, was the fate of the sisters. Despite extensive searches, Margaret and Eliza were never found. There were no footprints around the house, no tracks in the snow, no signs of a hasty departure. It was as if they had disappeared just like the hunters, without a trace, without witnesses, without explanation. What happened next was recorded in letters and testimonies that have been partially preserved. Some families left Iron Hollow weeks later. Others forbade all men from going into the forest alone, and a small group of residents insisted on keeping watch over the sisters' house for consecutive nights. It was during one of these vigils that one of the men reported seeing a lamp lit inside the house, even though it was officially empty. The glow was faint, yellowish, as if burning old oil. It remained lit for about 10 minutes, then disappeared. Upon investigating the next morning, they found the lamp intact on the table, cold, clean, with no sign of recent use. This episode, reported by two men, divided opinions among historians. Some believe it was a misperception caused by fog and widespread fear. Others, however, argue that the light was one of the last concrete clues that someone was still entering or leaving the property unseen, as was the case with the hunters. Winter ended. The disappearances ceased as suddenly as they had begun. The sisters' house was abandoned, then closed off, and decades later it collapsed under the weight of time and the forest that slowly swallowed it. The case of the 39 missing hunters was never solved. No definitive evidence was found. No bodies, no tracks, no traces. The only thing that remains is the final report from that time, a short, cold, and almost clinical document, ending with the most disturbing sentence in the entire file. The basement has been closed, but we don't know what, in fact, is being left behind. And it is only decades later, when a researcher decides to revisit the case and interview the last living descendants of Iron Hollow, that new information emerges. Information that had never been officially recorded, and that would completely change the interpretation of what happened that winter. The researcher who revisited the Iron Hollow archives almost half a century after the events never imagined he would find anything beyond fragile papers, vague memories, and the marks of time. He traveled to the county at the request of a local university tasked with recording old cases of disappearance for historical purposes. His account, preserved in notes dating from the 1950s, begins soberly. "I didn't expect to find anything but silence." And he found silence, the kind of silence that seems to accumulate in abandoned places like fine dust that settles on all surfaces. The region had changed greatly since 1905. The village had lost its population, the hunter's trail had been partially swallowed by vegetation, and the old foundry, now just a twisted iron skeleton, had become an almost forgotten landmark. What remained of the Calder sisters' house was even less impressive. A few slanted beams, fragments of dark wood, and an uneven depression in the ground where the kitchen had once stood. The basement was gone. It had collapsed decades earlier, taking all the internal structures with it. The forest had taken over the place. Ferns sprouted between the rotting boards, moss covered what remained of the walls, and the wind blew unimpeded through what had once been doors and windows. The researcher believed that nothing there would bring him new conclusions, but his investigation only really began when he met Eleanor Ridge, one of the last direct descendants of residents who lived in the village at the time. She was over 80 years old, but she had a sharp memory and a surprising willingness to revisit painful stories. Their meeting is described in detail. She welcomed him on her porch, where the afternoon sun created golden spots on the wooden floor. The researcher noted that the lady spoke slowly, as if she feared that each word would bring back something that had been kept hidden for a long time. And it was only after hesitating for several long seconds that Eleanor recounted what she knew. According to her, her mother, who was only 9 years old in 1905, observed something that was never officially recorded. On one of the coldest mornings of that winter, long before the men organized formal searches, the girl saw, from the window of her house, 2 figures walking along the trail that led to the Iron Hollow slope. They were women, thin, wearing dark cloaks. They walked side by side, as always, in synchronized steps, staring straight ahead. The child recognized the Calder sisters immediately, but what stuck in her memory forever was not the fact that they were on the trail. It was the direction they were heading. They were not walking toward the village, nor were they heading toward their own property. They were heading toward the valley, the same valley where, years later, dozens of hunters' trails would abruptly disappear. "My mother said she had never seen 2 people look so tired," Eleanor said. as if they were walking to a place they already knew, but were afraid to reach. The researcher wrote everything down without comment. Then he asked the woman why that information had never been shared with the authorities at the... Her answer was as sincere as it was devastating, because no one at that time talked about what they saw. Everyone was afraid to put into words something they couldn't explain. This revelation, though simple, profoundly altered the understanding of the case. It suggested that the sisters did not run away. They did not disappear from the house inexplicably. They did not evaporate as so many imagined. On the contrary, they walked away on their own toward the same valley where so many men lost their way and never returned. For the researcher, this information changed the tone of the investigation. He revisited the maps of the time, reanalyzed the distances, reconsidered the reports of metallic sounds and attempts to reinforce the basement. And he began to formulate a hypothesis that, although never completely proven, became the most humane and, in a way, most tragic interpretation of what happened in Iron Hollow. According to his reading of the facts, the Calder sisters were not responsible for the disappearances. There was no concrete evidence that they had lured or led anyone into the underground chamber. What seemed more likely was that they had been dealing with some kind of silent threat from the forest for many years, something known only to those who lived isolated among the hills and valleys, something that required constant vigilance. The reinforcement of the basement, according to this interpretation, was not a structure for imprisonment. It was a makeshift fortress, built not to contain people, but to protect themselves from something outside. Something that, for them, was real enough to justify iron beams and reinforced doors. Not supernatural, just part of the harshness of the environment and the extreme conditions of the region. And when the disappearances began, the researcher believes the sisters understood before anyone else that this threat, whether geographical, human, or environmental, was approaching again. And so they left, not to flee the village, but to prevent more men from heading into the valley, unaware of what awaited them. The hypothesis could never be proven. There were not enough witnesses. There were no documents to fully support this version. It was just a thin thread, woven together from accounts of fear, silence, and despair. But for the researcher, it made more sense than any theory that blamed two reclusive women for dozens of disappearances. He ended his last note with a phrase that rarely appears in academic texts, an emotional, almost intimate phrase that shows how the case affected him. Sometimes, the only ones who try to prevent a tragedy are precisely those whom the rest of the world chooses not to see. Today, the forest covers everything. The valley is just a lost dip among dense trees. The footprints of that winter disappeared over a century ago, and the story of the 39 lives that never returned dissolved into the same silence that once took over the village. But when the wind blows strongly between the hills, carrying fragments of snow and memory, many longtime residents say there is a stretch of the trail where the sound changes, where the air seems denser, colder, where the past still breathes, even if no one can explain how. And it is there, at that point where so many stories fade away, that the researcher chose to end his report, leaving one last line, simple, whispered, definitive. Iron Hollow never explained anything, and perhaps that is the only reason we still remember.